Morning. Some of you I know better than others. Some of you have had an opportunity to be around quite a bit. I was here for a couple of Wednesday nights back in the summer, and then a few of you I've gotten to know better since then. There's a few people here that have been volunteering at the hospital, and that's been incredibly helpful. So some of you I know fairly well. Others, this might be the first time I've met you, but I'm glad that everybody is here. I know we also have a pretty wide age span. How young is our youngest that is here? 4 days. So I won't ask who the oldest is, but we have 4 days all the way up until some that are older. But we do appreciate everybody being here. Just a little bit about myself and kind of how this series came to be. So I work as a chaplain with U of L Health. A chaplain is somebody that's over the chapel space and then also the spiritual and religious aspects and programs of a hospital and things that pertain to the patients and the staff in those areas. And chaplains have a process of training and board certification. And as part of sort of the annual maintenance of that certification, one thing that I can do toward hours for that is community speaking on the setting where I work. So given that I'm a chaplain at U of L Health's mental health facility, Peace Hospital, their behavioral health, psychiatry. So I had the idea, what would it look like if I created a series intended for churches on mental health? And that's how this came to be, and I was talking to Eric, and so that's how all this came to be, and I appreciate you all being the first place to put this on. So this is sort of the trial of it, so feel very free to give any sort of feedback that you might have. Both compliments and critiques. I'm open to both, but thank you all for being here. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm a chaplain at a hospital. But I do have a lot of involvement with these issues there. Also, I want today to be helpful. I want to be very sensitive and compassionate toward these things. That is my goal. And if there's anything that you think would be a better way of saying something or phrasing something or even something I haven't thought about, feel free by all means to bring that up. I want this to be helpful and not hurtful in any way. And I'm also fully aware that there are a lot of people in here, most likely, who have struggled with these things at one point or another, because that's the reality of the situation, myself included. And so I want us to be compassionate and sensitive and helpful throughout the day today. I've called this series, Let's Talk About It, because that's what I hope to do, is to encourage conversation, to talk about things that sometimes in the church don't get talked about all that often. There is a handout, and so if you have one of those, I've just provided some space on that to take some notes along the way if you want to. I thought about that later on. The order is a little bit different. I wasn't fully aware of the order of the service here, so dementia is actually going to be during the time for Bible class. So if you want to turn a couple pages over, that'll be today during our worship time will be depression and anxiety is what we're looking at. So I apologize about that, about the order not being what it should be. So the title for our day, Let's Talk About It. That's what I want to encourage us to do. And a verse out of the Psalms that I've based this on is Psalm 39 and verse 2. I was speechless and quiet. I kept silence even from speaking good, and my pain intensified. And while this verse out of this psalm might not be directly related per se to mental health, I think it's a very applicable verse in talking about it, and the concept that when we just hold things in, so often it doesn't make it better. In reality, it makes it worse. I was speechless and quiet. I kept silent, and my pain intensified. And that is so often the case with these issues. And so the intent is to go from silence to speaking. Let's talk about it as individuals and collectively as the church. So when we think about mental health, what is it that we're talking about? We're going to look today at some different big issues, and each of these is very much just intended to sort of touch the surface and kind of introduce the topic. So we're going to have a presentation on depression. Also in our worship time this morning, talk about anxiety. After that, for the class period, will be dementia, and then for the afternoon will be addiction. So as I've talked to people about developing this series and what's needed, I found that those are the 4 consistent ones that come up. And so those are going to be the 4 that we touch on today. But to begin with, when we use the phrase mental health, what are we talking about? How could we go about defining that? The World Health Organization has a definition, and they define mental health as related to mental and psychological well-being. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. So when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about our emotional, psychological, social well-being, which then impacts how we think, how we feel, and how we act. All of those things are very integral to our faith as well. All of that is connected to what it means to be a Christian, I would suggest. How we think, how we feel, how we act, how we understand ourselves, how we understand others. So then, is there anything in the Bible really about mental health? Well, on the one hand, that wording is not necessarily used, but I do think there's certain kind of concepts and ideas, categories that whereas people in the early church maybe didn't use that language, I do think that there's some sort of topics that have some overlap to this idea of emotional, psychological, social well-being and how you think, feel, and act. So, for example, when we look at a passage like Philippians 4 and verse 7, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. There's something larger there being expressed than just the heart that beats blood, something larger than just the brain that's in our skull. While Paul in his day, and nobody in his day, would have used the phrasing mental health, just like they wouldn't have talked about an x-ray or prescriptions that we have or those sort of things, there are, I believe, some similarities between some of the things that have to do with the hearts, the mind, that sort of a concept. The prayer for this congregation in Philippi isn't, I hope you all have good mental health, but there's some similarity there. And I'd encourage us to just kind of reflect on that a little bit. So as a kind of an exercise this morning, you don't have to make a big show of this, but just to try to illustrate something, I want you to think about pointing to your feet. And if you actually want to point to your feet, you can. Point to your feet. Point to your nose. All right, thank you for the participation. Here we go. All right, point to your brain. All right, most of us know where it is. And now point to your emotional, psychological, and social well-being. That's a harder thing to do. Some of us are kind of doing like an overall thing, but then also that would go out to the people around you as well. So if I was to say point to your brain, you know where that is. But then if essentially I said point to your mental health, it's not exactly the same thing. Brain health and mental health, while at times related, are not exactly the same. One refers to anatomy and a structure that we have. The other has to do with our way of being in the world and our way of understanding ourselves and other people. So then what causes issues, problems with this? What causes mental health issues? There's a piece of art that's called the Duck Rabbit that I think is very helpful. I like the Duck Rabbit when talking about several different things. Some of you, when you first see this image, might see a duck. And if you see the duck, there's a beak, or whatever you would call it on a duck, going out this way. And the eye is back here. The duck is facing that direction. Some of you might see a rabbit. And if you see a rabbit, there's the eye, and the rabbit is facing that way. And when we ask the question, what causes mental health issues, some people will say it is all very environmental. It's all about the atmosphere that somebody is in, the environment, the situation, the things they've been exposed to. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that. Some people that speak and that write will say it's much more biological. It's all chemistry and more has to do with brain health. And what I just want to point out with that is to say, this camp, yes, that's right. And this camp, yes, that's probably right too. It's not just a one thing. And we truthfully, there's a lot of things we don't fully know and understand about it all. It's related to the environments we find ourselves in. It's related to our biology, our chemistry. It's a yes, and it's a yes, and there's probably other things, and it's a yes. And so I'm just saying it's really difficult to pinpoint any issue and say this is the cause. It's a bigger, broader, more complex picture than that. So what I want to do with each of these presentations, and again, I don't intend for any of these to be that long. It's more intended as an introduction to the topic and to say, let's talk about this and be comfortable talking about it. But the structure that we're going to follow with each of these is going to be the same, kind of moving through 5 parts. So the first, what are some terms? When we use this term, what does the term mean? Where does it come from? Secondly, from a more clinical standpoint, what are symptoms? Third, is there anything in the Bible that this wording isn't necessarily used, but is there anything in the Bible that sort of connects with what those symptoms would be? Fourth, what are some ways collectively to support each other? Practical suggestions for the church. And then fifth, a psalm that I think really expresses in one way or another the thing we're talking about. So that's what we're going to do with each of these 4 presentations. The first one being depression, second, anxiety, third, dementia, fourth, addiction. So again, I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to be here. So when we think about depression and we think about terms that are used, where does this word even come from? Well, what it really literally refers to is being depressed, the state of being pressed down, or a sinking or a lowering. And I was thinking about a loaf of bread. I almost brought in a loaf of bread. If you think about buying a loaf of bread at the store, you can buy a loaf of bread and you pull it off the shelf, and it's at this state. You could, however, because I've done this before, you could push that loaf of bread down, and it's about around there. It's all the same bread that's in there, but it has depressed. And sometimes we ourselves, for whatever reason it might be, become depressed. It's a state of being pressed down. It's a sinking. It's a lowering. There was a study conducted, and what they did with this study, it was an interview study of those who had a clinical diagnosis of a depression disorder, and they asked them to describe what does it feel like when you're in one of those episodes, when you're in a time of being depressed. And this is the one that I thought was the most vivid, maybe, if you will. It said it was like looking out on a landscape that was total desolation, where once there had been growth and possibilities, now there was just nothing. Just nothing but desolation. Words can't really describe it. Like I was looking at things that I had seen 100 times before, and they looked different. I could see them, but I couldn't feel them. And as I thought about the language that was used there, it made me think about the difference between a summer and a winter. So in the summer, where everything is growing and it's green and it's vibrant, you then have, in contrast, the winter, where everything is dark and it's bleak and there's not growth. And what seems to often be the case is with issues of depression. Again, we don't fully know everything about it. But what seems to be the case with many is that when we expect there to be summer, and then we find ourselves in winter, that it's then that pressed down experience. Very often, people have episodes of depression after graduating. It's college, maybe. They then can't find a job. After sometimes getting married, and there's challenges there. After having children. After sometimes entering retirement. After having a geographic change for a job. These things where everything's going to be great now. This is going to be good, and it's about to be as though we're in summertime. And then we find ourselves in a winter. And it just, again, not saying this is a blanket statement for everybody, but it seems to be the case for many that when there's a major life change that we think is going to bring a perpetual summer, and then we encounter the challenges and the difficulties, we encounter that depressed stage or period. This is something that I have found to be very helpful. It looks like it shows up pretty well on the screen. This is referred to as the mood meter. If you want to look more into that later, I think this is a very helpful tool. There was a book written called Permission to Feel, where this was proposed. I think it's a very helpful resource. But this was a proposal of how to understand emotion. And what this chart does is from, that would be your right, from right to left is feelings of pleasantness or contentment, satisfaction, things are okay. So this side represents when we're feeling pretty good. The others, and then it goes this way into feelings of less pleasantness, less contentment, less satisfaction as you move further this way. Going up and down is energy level. How energized do we feel? And with this tool, it's pretty easy then when you think about contentment or pleasantness going this way to this way, and then energy going this way to that way, to pretty easily sort of map ourselves and the other people around us as well. So if we have a lot of energy and things are going really well, we would be in the top quadrant, and the yellow representing happiness. And it gives us a lot of different words and a vocabulary for that. If we are feeling really good, but we have lower energy, it's feelings of peacefulness. And so you have a lot of words for that. If things aren't going as well, and we have lower energy, it's in the blue and feelings and words for sadness. And then if we're not feeling so good, but we have higher energy, feelings for anger, anxiety up in the red. So I think this is a really helpful tool, and we'll come back to this again a couple times throughout the day. But just to say that when we're talking about depression, if we were to map it on the mood and the feeling, it would be not feeling very good about things and having low energy because we're pressed down. So we would be over in the blue. So what then are some symptoms from a clinical sort of perspective? And I'll just click through these. A depressed mood most of the day, a loss of interest in activities, weight change, that can be a loss or a gain, sleeping too much or not enough, psychomotor agitation, which would be fidgeting, tapping, touching something. And I have just noticed for myself that if I'm not feeling well, I've started to notice this for myself as being something that I can pick up on. And I'm very, that sort of a thing. So, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, an inability to concentrate, recurrent suicidal thoughts. And as far as the process of diagnosis from a clinical perspective, what the criteria is for 5 of the things on this list to be present together for a 2-week period of time. So when we talk about diagnosis, there is a manual that physicians go off of, and for differing conditions, there's criteria. And for a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder, the criteria is 5 of these symptoms together for a 2-week period of time. That's the clinical perspective. When we do talk about that, however, it's interesting because it's not like other branches of medicine, like an x-ray, for example. If you go to the emergency department, they think something's wrong, they take an x-ray, they can see if the bone is broken or not. In mental health, there are not x-rays in that way. There's more and more that's being capable in terms of brain scans and things, but it's a very different sort of type of medicine. And so with that being the case, just be aware that there is some disagreement in terms of the process and the criteria of diagnosis in mental health. So just be aware of that there is some difference, there's some disagreement out there, because it's not something that you can just take an x-ray on. It's the reporting of behavior and of trends and of how a person is feeling, oftentimes self-reported or reported by someone else. So when we then turn to the Bible, is there any example in the Bible of depression? Well, the word isn't used, and I would even say they didn't really have a word in Hebrew or Greek like we do for clinical depression. But the thing that I would identify as being the closest and sort of as a good point of conversation is Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And although Elijah here doesn't meet necessarily all of the clinical standards, I would say that if Elijah were to show up at the hospital where I work, or if somebody were to bring him there, and he says, "Take away my life," Elijah is going to be staying there for a while. Maybe a few days, but Elijah isn't going to leave the hospital with that statement. And so when we think about the Bible and mental health, that's sort of the approach that I'm encouraging us to think about, is that these issues do present themselves in the pages of Scripture. And so I think this would be an example and a place of conversation for that. Well, what are some practical suggestions for the church? And I'll offer a few with each of these topics that we look at. The first would be, don't minimize. I think we have a tendency, and I use we very loosely, but in the church, maybe especially at times, there's a tendency to sort of minimize and to say, "Well, that's not really, you're okay," that sort of a thing. And one of the big reasons as to why we shouldn't minimize is because there's definitely a link that's been established between depression and suicide. That link has been very well established and is very real between episodes of depression and suicide and suicidal thinking and suicidal acts. And so I'm going to click through just some graphs. I'm not going to go into all the various details. I personally don't even remember all the ins and outs of all of these studies and graphs, but I just want to click through some trends. This is a graph of suicide numbers, and again, I realize that these are sensitive topics, closer to home perhaps for some than others. But this is a graph of trends from 2000. I have to get real close and squint, so I doubt you can see the numbers, but 2000 to 2022, and there's definitely an upward trend over the last 20-ish years or so. This is a graph showing suicides between males and females. Males have a higher rate of completed suicide than do females, oftentimes because males are more comfortable with using more lethal means. And again, I know this is sensitive issues, but that's the reality. And then this one might be one of the most surprising. This is suicide by age. And it is starting from young ages, starting from age 10, going up to 85 plus. The highest number, according to this data, of completed suicides is 85 plus. To me, that was a surprising data. We tend to talk more, I think, and think more about younger populations being more at risk, when in reality it can be the opposite trending. It's rising a lot among young people, but from what I understand, just the numbers, it's the older populations. Situations in hospice, nursing homes, hospitals. A person decides they no longer want to live. And that's, I think, just a good awareness for us to have. I think about the passage in Jeremiah 6 and verse 14. They have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. And I think that that's a passage that can be applied to the issues that we're talking about, that we need to be careful of saying peace, peace, when there is no peace, and minimizing what might be going on. A second suggestion is to listen. That we as the church need to be a group of people, a community that are willing to listen. That we should embody and look like Galatians 5:22 and 23. And if later you want to tell me that slide is misspelled with Galatians, you can remind me of that. So I don't know if you saw it, but I'll point it out in case you did. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And I think if a group of people are looking like those things, we are then going to be a group of people willing to take the time to listen to each other with compassion, with empathy, with understanding. The opposite is to always have something to say. In Proverbs 18 and verse 2 says, "A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart." We often want to go into advice giving rather than listening. You think about Job's friends, very similar. As long as they were sitting there with him, it was okay, but then they started talking. Be willing to listen. Look backward to move forward, and that will be a recurrent theme through today. That very often when something is going on in the moment, in the present, there is something in the person's past that is connected to that. There's something that they have encountered, something that they have gone through in the past that is continuing to impact them in the present. And to be a group of people that are comfortable looking backward with each other. Looking backward first before trying to move forward. Sometimes we want to try to move forward rather than first looking backward. Getting to know each other well enough to know what happened, what's going on. And then a fourth practical suggestion, stay where they are. Meaning, as Romans 12 and verse 15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. If we go back to our chart here, what I have seen very often is that we tend to want to move a person rather than stay where they are and listen to them and understand them. People tend to want to move them to the opposite of where they are. So if a person is down here, a lot of people are not okay with the person being down there, especially if you're a Christian. People tend to not be okay with people sometimes being down here. And so what we want to do is take them from the blue to the yellow. Okay, it's time to be happy now. You're a Christian, time to be happy now. We try to move them to the yellow. Or if a person is in the red, experiencing the words in the red, okay, well, you need to calm down now. You need to be more peaceful. And I think what this allows us to see is that when we do that, we're making them do a complete 180 in how they're feeling. And very often it's not helpful. It's not going to be met well. They are in the blue for a reason. And rather than just trying to yank them out of that and throw them up into the yellow, be comfortable being in the blue with them and trying to figure out empathetically and compassionately why that is. And realize that it's okay to feel sad. There are things that happen where the appropriate response is to feel sad for a period of time. The appropriate response to something might be to be angry about it. And so to be empathetic and to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep and really live out that passage requires that we understand where our brothers and sisters are, and then we're willing to stay with them there. And that is how the person eventually will move out of that. I think if there's anything that I want us to understand from today, it's that. that if the person is to ever move out of the blue, we collectively have to be willing to stay with them in the blue, and it might take a while. It is not helpful for them to be in the blue and to say, okay, time for you to be happy now. Time for you to sing and be happy. We don't always feel like singing and being happy, and it might be that we don't need to sing and be happy with whatever it is that we're facing in life right then. What we need is for a group of people to be willing to sit in the sadness with us for a while. And then eventually we'll move out of that. Well, is there a psalm that would be helpful? I think Psalm 88 is an incredibly helpful psalm for the suffering. One of the functions of the Psalms is that they help us to feel less alone. We read the Psalms and we can come to understand that other people have felt similarly. Rather than read the whole psalm, the verses I really want us to look at are Psalm 88, verses 8 and 9, and verse 18. You have put away my acquaintances far from me. You have made me an abomination to them. I am shut up and I cannot get out. My eye wastes away because of affliction. Lord, I have called upon you. I have stretched out my hands to you. And we could go on and continue to read, but if we skip down to verse 18. Loved one and friend, you have put far from me, and my acquaintances into darkness. Many of us perhaps are familiar with Psalms like Psalm 23, where the waters are still and the pastures are green, and the Lord is the shepherd. And yet there are many psalms that sound more like Psalm 88. Lord, where are you right now? Where are my friends? What has happened? Why am I in darkness? And I believe what these psalms are teaching us is that it's okay to express that to one another. It's okay to express that to God. There's times of life where we're living in the darkness. We're living in the blue.